December 2nd, 1993. Medellín, Colombia. For years, his name alone sent shivers down the spines of presidents, police officers, and rival criminals alike. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, the most powerful drug lord the world had ever seen. The man who once controlled 80% of the global cocaine trade. A billionaire many times over, with wealth so vast that rats ate millions of dollars in stored cash before he could spend it. A man who ordered assassinations with a flick of his wrist and bought the loyalty of thousands with a mere whisper. But tonight, none of that matters. None of it can protect him now. He is no longer the emperor of an empire. He is no longer the untouchable patron of Medellín. He is a fugitive, hunted like an animal, scurrying from one hiding place to another, never stopping long enough to be found. Gone are the private armies, the armored vehicles, the safe havens built into sprawling estates. Gone are the days when politicians groveled at his feet and journalists feared to speak his name. Now he is alone. He has been on the run for 16 months. 16 months of paranoia, of sleepless nights in safe houses, of whispered betrayals and silent executions. The walls around him have crumbled, piece by piece. His cartel, once an unstoppable force of violence and corruption, has been dismantled by the relentless war waged against him. His allies, once unwaveringly loyal, have either fled, been killed, or turned against him. Even his family, his wife, his children, have been forced into exile, abandoned to the mercy of the very government he once mocked. And yet, despite it all, he remains defiant. He has lived through too much, survived too many close calls to believe this is truly the end. In his mind, he is still Pablo Escobar, still the man who walked out of his own self-built prison when it no longer suited him. Still the man who once declared war on an entire country and nearly won. He believes there is always a way out, always one last move to make. But what he does not realize, what he cannot accept, is that the world has changed. The forces against him have learned from their failures. The government that once feared him has grown ruthless, emboldened by American intelligence and military aid. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the CIA, the Colombian National Police, all of them have spent years perfecting their strategy, adapting to every trick he used to evade capture. And tonight, they have found him. Somewhere in the shadows, in the narrow streets of Medellín, men are moving. Soldiers, police officers, intelligence operatives, hardened men who have spent years chasing him, who have lost friends and comrades to his reign of terror. They have not forgotten the bombings, the assassinations, the massacres he orchestrated. They remember the bloodied bodies of judges, journalists, politicians, and innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire of his war against the state. For them, this is not just another mission. It is personal. They have spent months tracking his movements, piecing together scraps of intelligence, following the whispers of informants too terrified to speak his name aloud. They have waited patiently, methodically, for the moment he would slip up, for the one mistake that would lead them straight to him. And now, at last, that moment has come. Because for the first time in months, Pablo Escobar has made a mistake. A simple, careless mistake that will cost him everything. He has stayed on the phone for too long. For weeks, he has been cautious, keeping his conversations brief, never speaking long enough for the authorities to trace the call. But today, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps out of arrogance, he has let his guard down. He has stayed on the line just a few seconds too long, enough for the surveillance team to pinpoint his exact location. In that moment, the game is over. The call is intercepted. The coordinates are locked in. And now, the men who have spent years hunting him are on the move. Escobar doesn't know it yet, but his fate has already been decided. The hunter has become the hunted. And this time, there is nowhere left to run. Pablo Escobar stares at the wall of his safe house, lost in thought. The paint is cracked and peeling. The air is stale with the scent of sweat and cigarette smoke. This is not the life he built for himself. This is not the empire he once commanded. The room is small, barely furnished, a cheap mattress on the floor, a wooden chair that wobbles when he shifts his weight, a plastic table covered in radio equipment, cash, and a half-eaten meal that has gone cold. The days of golden chandeliers and marble floors are gone. The sprawling estates with private zoos, gone. The armed guards patrolling his properties, gone. This is what remains of Pablo Escobar. His empire, once an unstoppable force of corruption and terror, has collapsed. His top lieutenants have been captured or killed. The Medellín Cartel is no longer the world's most feared criminal organization. It is a memory, a shadow of what it once was. The same men who once called him patron now work against him, feeding information to the authorities in exchange for their own survival. The police, once terrified of uttering his name, now move through Medellín with confidence, knowing their greatest enemy is finally on the verge of defeat. Escobar had always known this day might come. He had always understood that power, no matter how great, never lasts forever. But he never thought it would end like this. Not hiding in a run-down safe house, not pacing the floor in nervous silence while enemies surround him on all sides. Outside, the city moves on without him. Medellín, the place he once ruled with an iron grip, has changed. The people who once lived in fear of his wrath have begun to breathe again. The war he waged against the Colombian government, the bombings, the assassinations, the relentless bloodshed has finally begun to fade. But Escobar is still here, still alive. And in his mind, that means the war is not yet over. He turns to his last remaining bodyguard, Álvaro de Jesús Agudelo, known simply as El Limón. Once, Escobar had hundreds of men willing to die for him. Now, only El Limón remains, loyal to the end or perhaps too afraid to betray him. Escobar speaks, his voice low, steady. They think they've won. El Limón says nothing. He doesn't need to. They both know the truth. The government hasn't won. Not yet. But they are close. Too close. Escobar walks to the table, picks up a radio, and listens to the chatter of his enemies. He knows they are out there hunting him. He knows the search block will never stop. He has spent months avoiding their checkpoints, slipping through their fingers again and again. But he also knows that luck, like power, runs out, and his is running out fast. He rubs his face, feeling the stubble on his chin. The weight of exhaustion drags at him. He hasn't slept well in months, always one ear open, always ready to run. The paranoia never leaves him. Every sound outside makes him flinch. Every knock at the door sends his hand to his gun. For a man who once controlled billions, who once had presidents in his pocket, life has been reduced to this. Hiding in a borrowed house, listening to a crackling radio, waiting for the inevitable. His wife and children are gone, smuggled out of the country, forced into exile. He has no way to reach them. He wonders if they are safe. Wonders if they will ever see him again. He closes his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle in. The memories flood back. The rise, the power, the money, the untouchable status he once held. He remembers the fear in the eyes of politicians when he walked into a room. He remembers the days when his word was law. Those days are over. Now, he is just a man with nowhere left to run. And outside, the hunters are closing in. They have been chasing him for years. The Bloque de Búsqueda, the elite Colombian police unit formed solely for the purpose of capturing or killing Pablo Escobar, has never been closer. Every failure, every near miss, has only sharpened their resolve. They have hunted him across jungles, mountains, and the slums of Medellín. They have lost men, buried friends, seen comrades die in the line of duty, all for one purpose, to end Escobar's reign of terror once and for all. There is no hesitation among them, no fear. They have spent too long in the shadow of his violence to feel anything but determination. Their leader, Colonel Hugo Martinez, is the man Escobar has feared most over the past year. A seasoned police officer handpicked for this mission, Martinez is relentless. He does not celebrate the small victories, does not rest when an informant gives them a new lead. He knows Escobar is a survivor, a master of escape, a man who has slipped through their grasp time and time again. But not this time. This time, they have him. The phone call, Escobar's fatal mistake, has changed everything. For months, their intelligence teams have been intercepting communications, monitoring his family, pressuring his former allies to give up information. They have relied on U.S. intelligence, on advanced tracking equipment, on satellite surveillance provided by the CIA. But it has never been enough. Escobar has always been one step ahead, always disappearing just before they arrive. Until now. The signal has been traced. Coordinates locked. A 2-story house in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellín. He is there. The order is given. The teams mobilize. Armored trucks roll out packed with heavily armed officers. Helicopters are in the air, circling the area. The streets are being locked down. There is no room for error. They have lost him too many times. There will be no escape today. As they move in, the weight of history is upon them. Escobar is not just a criminal. He is a legend, a ghost, a man whose name has become larger than life. For years he has defied the laws of man, waged war against an entire country, and walked away untouched. His money has bought him protection, his ruthlessness has secured his survival. He has killed judges, politicians, journalists, police officers, innocent civilians, anyone who stood in his way. But now, for the first time, he is truly alone. No army to defend him, no escape route planned, no allies left to call. The search block knows this is their moment. They grip their rifles tighter, their boots pounding against the pavement as they advance toward the house. Inside, Pablo Escobar listens to the static on his radio, unaware that death is already at his doorstep. Inside the small, decrepit house in Los Olivos, Pablo Escobar sits in silence. The room is dim, the curtains drawn shut, but he can feel the midday sun pressing against the walls, making the air thick and stifling. He wipes the sweat from his brow, his fingers lingering on the deep lines etched into his face. For a moment, he allows himself to believe he still has time. The radio crackles beside him, feeding him whispers from the outside world. He listens intently, searching for any sign that something is wrong. He hears static. Then a burst of voices, too faint to make out. His instincts tell him something is coming. But what? He glances at El Limon, the last man still willing to die for him. The bodyguard stands near the window, gripping his weapon tightly, eyes scanning the street below. His breathing is heavy, his muscles tense. He feels it too, that strange electric tension in the air. Escobar reaches for the pistol beside him, a 9mm Sig Sauer. Not his usual weapon of choice, but these days, he takes what he can get. He runs his fingers over the grip, feeling the weight of it in his palm. It's been years since he's had to fight for his life with his own hands. Years since he's had to be the one holding the gun, rather than the one giving the orders. He remembers the last time he felt this way. La Catedral, the day he walked out of his own prison, defying the entire Colombian government. That time, he had power. That time, he had an army waiting for him on the outside. Now, there is no one. The radio crackles again. Then a single word cuts through the static. Ubicado. Located. For a split second, Escobar does not move. Then, outside, the world erupts. The silence before the storm is brief, just a heartbeat. Just enough time for Pablo Escobar to register the meaning of that one word. Ubicado. Located. Found. No more running. Then the first gunshot shatters the air. A sharp, deafening crack from outside, followed by the roar of boots pounding against the pavement. Shouted orders ring out from the street, doors slam, radios chirp. The men who have spent years hunting him are here, and they are moving fast. El Limon jerks toward the window, yanking back the curtain. His breath catches. They are everywhere. A swarm of heavily armed officers, their rifles raised, their bodies crouched low as they advance. The armored trucks block off the street. Snipers position themselves on rooftops. Helicopters circle above, casting shadows that flicker through the dusty windows. Escobar grips his pistol. The metal is warm in his palm, but his fingers feel cold. His mind races, calculating, strategizing, looking for a way out. Some gap in their formation, some mistake he can exploit, but there is none. He hears the heavy crash of a battering ram hitting the front door. Once, twice, then boom. The door explodes inward. Gunfire erupts. Bullets rip through the walls, shattering glass, splintering wood. The deafening pop, pop, pop of automatic rifles fills the air, the smell of gunpowder thick and choking. Escobar and El Limon throw themselves backward, scrambling for cover. A barrage of bullets slams into the furniture, tearing through the flimsy walls like paper. Dust and debris rain down. There is no time to think, no time to hesitate. Escobar knows what happens if they take him alive. The Americans want him in a cell. The Colombian government wants him as a trophy. His enemies in the underworld want him tortured, humiliated. But Escobar will not be caged. El Tejado, he hisses. The roof. El Limon nods. No words are needed. They both know there is only one way out. Gunfire still echoes through the house, bullets slicing through the air. The walls shake from the force of the assault. The search block is inside now, storming room after room, clearing each space with ruthless precision. Escobar grips his pistol tighter and runs. The end is coming. but he refuses to go down without a fight. Pablo Escobar's feet pound against the creaking wooden stairs as he ascends, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. His body is heavier than it once was, slower, but adrenaline surges through him. The walls shake with the relentless gunfire below. Shouts, boots, and bursts of automatic fire echo through the house. Behind him, El Limón is right on his heels, gripping his pistol, eyes darting back as the search block breaches the lower rooms. They burst through the door to the rooftop. The bright Medellín sun blinds them for a second. The rooftop is flat, the red clay tiles cracked with age. From here, Escobar sees the narrow street below, the soldiers pouring into the house like ants, the armored vehicles blocking every escape route. The city stretches beyond them, his city. The streets, the people, the hills rolling in the distance. Once, he had owned all of it. Once, it had bent to his will. Now, it does not even turn to look. A voice crackles over the police radio. "Está en el tejado." He's on the roof. Then, the first shot comes. A bullet slams into El Limon's chest. His body jolts, his fingers go limp, and his gun clatters to the ground. He stumbles, gasps, eyes wide in disbelief, then crumples forward, his body rolling down the sloping tiles. Escobar doesn't look back. He doesn't have time to. He raises his pistol, firing wildly toward the streets below, toward the figures moving through the windows, toward the ghosts that have chased him for years. A bullet whizzes past his ear. Another rips into his thigh. His leg buckles. He stumbles, catching himself against the ledge, gritting his teeth as pain flares through his body. Blood soaks his jeans, but he stays on his feet. His breathing is ragged now. The world tilts. A final shot cracks through the air. A sharp, searing pain explodes through his skull. He doesn't even hear the bullet. He only feels the impact, the sudden weightlessness as his body tips forward, as the ledge vanishes beneath him, as the sky and the ground blur together. For a moment, there is nothing but falling. Then, Pablo Escobar crashes onto the rooftop below, his lifeless body sprawled across the red tiles, blood pooling beneath his head. The king of Medellín is dead. The city does not fall silent. There is no sudden stillness, no pause in the world to mark the death of its most infamous son. Instead, there is noise. Shouts echo through the streets. Radios buzz with confirmation. Helicopters hover overhead, their blades chopping the air in rhythmic finality. The search block officers move swiftly, their weapons still raised, their eyes scanning for any lingering threat. But there is none. Pablo Escobar, the most wanted man in the world, lies dead on a rooftop, his blood seeping into the terracotta tiles. His body is still, his face frozen in an expression that is neither fear nor defiance, just emptiness. Some officers lower their weapons, exhaling in relief. Others stare at the lifeless body, as if waiting for him to move, to rise, to prove once again that he is unkillable. But Escobar does not move. A radio transmission cuts through the static. Confirmado. Objetivo eliminado. Confirmed. The target is eliminated. At the base of the building, Colonel Hugo Martinez steps out of an armored vehicle. He moves slowly, deliberately, his face unreadable. He has spent years hunting this man, dedicating his life to dismantling the empire Escobar built. And now, after countless lives lost, after bloodshed that has scarred an entire nation, it is over. He makes his way up the stairs, through the bullet-riddled house, past the shattered furniture and crumbling walls. The air is thick with gunpowder and sweat. The bodies of Escobar and El Limón are sprawled on the rooftop, motionless under the unforgiving sun. Martinez stops a few feet away. He does not speak, he does not gloat, he simply looks. The monster is dead. But the scars he left behind will never fade. Within hours, the news spreads across Medellín, across Colombia, across the world. The headlines scream his name. Escobar muerto. In the poorest neighborhoods where his drug money once built homes and fed hungry families, some mourn him. To them, he was more than a criminal. He was a provider, a man who defied the rich and gave to the poor. They refuse to believe the news. Some whisper that he faked his death, that he is alive somewhere, waiting. But the truth is undeniable. The photos emerge, the bloated, bloodied face, the bullet hole in his skull, the officers posing over his body like hunters with their kill. In Bogotá, the government breathes a sigh of relief. In Washington, officials call it a victory in the war on drugs. But in Medellín, in the streets that once belonged to him, a different question lingers. Escobar is dead. But has anything truly changed? On the other side of Medellín, far from the blood-stained rooftop, a woman listens to a radio. Maria Victoria Henao, Pablo Escobar's wife, sits frozen in the dimly lit room, her hands gripping the edges of the wooden table. The voice on the radio is steady, clinical, repeating the same message over and over. Pablo Escobar Gaviria ha sido abatido en Medellín, confirmado. Dead. She had known this day was coming. She had felt it creeping toward them for months, tightening like a noose. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the finality in the reporter's voice feels like a knife to the chest. Across from her, Juan Pablo, their son, stares at her in silence. He is barely a teenager, but today he is forced to become something else. The son of a dead man, the heir to nothing. There is no time for grief. Maria Victoria knows what happens next. Escobar's enemies will come for them now. The Cali cartel, the paramilitaries, the same corrupt officials who once took her husband's money and smiled in his presence. Now that he is gone, they will seek revenge. They will not let his family walk away untouched. Already the phone is ringing. Threats, demands, warnings. She does not answer. Instead, she gathers what little she can. Cash, passports, jewelry. Her hands shake, but she does not stop. Juan Pablo watches her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He does not cry. He has seen too much to cry now. In the world outside, the vultures are already circling. In Medellín, former cartel allies scramble. Some vanish overnight, disappearing across borders, knowing the search block will come for them next. Others switch sides, pledging loyalty to new bosses, eager to survive in a world where Escobar's protection no longer exists. His empire, once untouchable, is now a carcass being torn apart. In Cali, his greatest rivals toast to his death. For years, they had been forced to operate in his shadow, always second to the main cartel. Now, that shadow is gone. They are the kings now. But not everyone celebrates. In the slums of Medellín, candles are lit in windows. Some whisper prayers. Others curse the government, claiming Escobar was the only one who cared for them. The Robin Hood of Colombia, gone forever. But there is no more time for legends. For Maria Victoria and her children, there is only survival. She grips Juan Pablo's hand. "We have to go," she says, her voice steady. Without another word, they step into the night, leaving behind the city that had once belonged to them. Escobar is dead, but his shadow will haunt Colombia for years to come. Pablo Escobar is dead, but in the underworld he left behind, death does not bring peace. It brings chaos. Within hours of his body hitting the rooftop, the Medellín cartel fractures. For years, its members operated under one supreme command, moving as a single entity beneath the will of their patron. But now, there is no leader, no rules, no fear of Escobar's wrath. The lieutenants who swore loyalty to him, men who once killed at a single nod of his head, begin whispering in the shadows. Some flee, knowing that without Escobar, they are nothing but targets. Others stay, believing they can carve out a piece of what remains. But the truth is written on every bullet-riddled wall of Medellín. The cartel is crumbling, and the vultures are circling. And the deadliest vultures of all are in Cali. The Cali cartel, long forced to work in Escobar's shadow, wastes no time. While Medellín descends into infighting, Cali makes its move. Their assassins strike fast, eliminating former Escobar loyalists one by one. The Pepes, the paramilitary death squads that once aided the government in the hunt for Escobar, now become executioners, ensuring no one rises to take his place. On the streets of Medellín, a new war erupts. Gunfights rage in broad daylight. Bodies turn up in alleyways, in the trunks of burned-out cars. Entire neighborhoods become battle zones as former sicarios fight for what little power remains. For the people of Medellín, the nightmare is not over. For years, they lived under Escobar's rule, fearing his justice but also surviving under his wealth. Now, there is only uncertainty. The government may have killed the king, but it has not killed the kingdom of violence he built. And soon, another truth emerges. Pablo Escobar was not the last of his kind. In the shadows, new drug lords rise, leaner, smarter, more cautious. They learn from his mistakes. They do not build grand estates or make themselves into Robin Hood figures. They work quietly, invisibly, expanding their reach beyond Colombia's borders. The war on drugs is far from over. Escobar's death was not the end. It was only the beginning of something even bigger. The moment the bullet struck Pablo Escobar's skull, the war on drugs changed forever. In Bogotá, the Colombian government declares victory. Press conferences are held, Cameras flash as officials speak of justice, of progress, of a new future free from the shadow of Escobar. In Washington, the news spreads quickly through the halls of power. The DEA, the CIA, the White House all claim credit for the operation. Escobar was their greatest enemy, the embodiment of the drug war, the man who turned cocaine into an empire. Now he is gone. And yet deep down, they know the truth. Escobar was not the drug trade, he was a symptom of it. The cocaine business does not slow. It does not collapse. If anything, it adapts. The Cali cartel, long content to let Escobar take the spotlight, steps into the vacuum, seizing control with quiet efficiency. Unlike Escobar, they do not wage open war against the government. They do not bomb buildings or execute politicians in the streets. Instead, they bribe, they infiltrate, they control from the shadows. By the time the government turns its full attention to Cali, their network has already spread beyond Colombia, reaching deep into Mexico, the United States, and Europe. The drug war is not won. It is simply entering a new phase. Meanwhile, the search block, the elite Colombian police unit that spent years hunting Escobar, finds itself without a mission. Some officers retire, their life's work complete. Others continue the fight, chasing new targets. And then there are the ones who vanish. Rumors swirl that some members of the search block worked with the Pepes, Escobar's sworn enemies, but they played both sides, using paramilitary groups to weaken the Medellín Cartel before moving in for the kill. That justice was not the only thing driving the hunt for Escobar. Revenge, greed, and power played a role too. The truth remains buried beneath classified reports, whispered conversations, and the bodies of those who knew too much. In the end, the Colombian government gets what it wanted. Escobar is dead, and the Medellín Cartel is no more. But the drug trade is stronger than ever. And for the people of Colombia, the violence does not end with Escobar's fall. It simply evolves. Pablo Escobar is dead, his empire has crumbled, his enemies have won, and yet his shadow still looms over the world. For the next generation of criminals, Escobar's rise and fall is more than history. It is a lesson. His life becomes a blueprint, a cautionary tale, a study in both power and destruction. Drug lords across Latin America take note. They see his mistakes, his arrogance, his obsession with fame, his reckless war against the government, and they vow to be different. In Mexico, the cartels evolve. No longer do they seek the spotlight like Escobar once did. They do not build extravagant estates or run for office. Instead, they move in silence, operating through proxy organizations, bribing officials at every level, making themselves invisible. The Sinaloa cartel, learning from Escobar's errors, perfects the art of corruption. They do not challenge the government with bombs and assassinations. They buy their way in. Their leaders remain shadows, myths rarely seen, rarely heard. They expand beyond Colombia's mistakes, turning the drug trade into a multi-billion-dollar global industry. Even in Colombia, Escobar's legacy refuses to die. The Medellín Cartel is gone, but in its place, smaller, more elusive groups rise. The Norte del Valle Cartel, the paramilitary-backed Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, and later the feared Clan del Golfo. They all follow the same path paved by Escobar, but with new strategies, new disguises. And in the minds of the poor, of the desperate, of those who still live in the slums he once controlled, Escobar becomes more than a man. He becomes a legend. His face appears on murals, on t-shirts, on keychains sold to tourists. Some see him as a villain, the man who drowned Colombia in blood. Others see him as a hero, a modern-day Robin Hood who defied the rich and gave to the poor. His name is spoken in hushed voices in barrios where his money once flowed. His story is told again and again. Books, documentaries, TV series. His life becomes entertainment, his crimes turned into drama for audiences who never saw the real destruction he left behind. And so, even in death, Pablo Escobar does what he always did best. He refuses to be forgotten, because in the world he helped shape, the drug trade is still alive. The violence continues, the cartels adapt, and Escobar's ghost watches over it all. Pablo Escobar is gone, but for his family, the nightmare is far from over. Maria Victoria Henao, his widow, moves quickly in the hours after his death. She has no choice. Escobar's enemies, rival cartels, former allies, even the Colombian government, will not let them live in peace. She gathers what little she can. Passports, hidden cash, whatever remains of the fortune that hasn't been seized or stolen. With her children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, she flees. But where can they go? Colombia is no longer safe. Every door is closed to them. The government wants them out, eager to erase any trace of Escobar's legacy. But outside Colombia, there are few places willing to take in the family of the world's most infamous drug lord. Argentina becomes their refuge. A new name, a new life. Maria Victoria becomes Maria Isabel Santos Caballero. Juan Pablo becomes Sebastián Marroquín. They try to disappear into the crowds of Buenos Aires, to live as ghosts in a foreign land. But escaping Escobar's shadow is impossible. The world does not forget. Journalists hunt them down, desperate for a glimpse of the widow and son of the fallen kingpin. Authorities watch them closely, suspicious of any remaining cartel connections. Even in exile, danger follows them. The Cali cartel, now the dominant power in Colombia, has not forgotten Escobar's war against them. They demand restitution, millions of dollars in blood money, a price to be paid for the sins of the father. Maria Victoria has no choice. She pleads with the Cali bosses, begs for her children's lives, offers up what little remains of Escobar's fortune to buy their safety. They let them live, but they will never be free. Juan Pablo, now Sebastián, grows into a man haunted by his father's name. He studies architecture, tries to build a life outside the weight of history. But every time he speaks, every time he writes, people do not see him. They see his father. Years later, he will tell the world, "I have to pay for the sins of my father every day of my life." For Maria Victoria, the burden is different. She was the wife of a man who built an empire on blood. The world will never see her as a victim, only as an accomplice. Years later, she will be arrested in Argentina, accused of money laundering, of trying to hide the last remnants of Escobar's wealth. She will deny it. She will claim she was just trying to survive. The truth? No one escapes Pablo Escobar, not even in death. His name will follow them forever, whispered in fear, in hatred, in admiration, because in the eyes of the world they are not just a grieving family. They are his last living ghosts. Medellín was once Pablo Escobar's kingdom. He ruled it not just with fear, but with money. His wealth built schools, hospitals, and entire neighborhoods for the poor. He handed out cash to families in need, paid for weddings, and even built a zoo filled with exotic animals. To many, he was not a criminal, he was their patron, their protector. But now, the patron is dead, and his city is left to pick up the pieces. In the days following his death, the streets of Medellín are eerily quiet. The sicarios who once terrorized the city either flee or are hunted down. The shootouts, the bombings, the public executions, suddenly they stop. The people, exhausted by years of bloodshed, dare to hope. But hope is fragile, because Escobar's death does not erase the scars he left behind. Entire neighborhoods, once fueled by his money, descend into poverty. Without his cartel's protection, unemployment soars. The children who once saw Escobar as their hero now face a different reality: hunger, crime, and survival in a city that no longer belongs to them. The government moves in quickly, eager to erase any trace of Escobar's rule. His properties are seized, his zoo abandoned, his name scrubbed from history books. The infamous Edificio Monaco, his luxurious fortress in the heart of Medellín, is demolished in an attempt to bury his legacy. But some memories refuse to die. In the slums, Escobar's name is still spoken with reverence. Some call him a monster, a man who brought nothing but pain. Others remember him as a savior, the only man who ever cared for the poor. And so, Medellín remains divided. It rebuilds, slowly, painfully. Foreign investors arrive, turning the once violent city into a tourist hotspot. New businesses emerge, replacing the cocaine economy that once ruled the streets. But beneath the polished image, the ghosts remain. Escobar's former empire, the billions he made, the men he trained, the violence he normalized, has not disappeared. It has simply changed form, moved to different hands, spread beyond Medellín's borders. The drug trade does not die. The power simply shifts, and Medellín, the city that once belonged to Pablo Escobar, will forever live with the weight of his name. Because no matter how much the world tries to forget him, Medellín never will. The hunt for Pablo Escobar was the most intense manhunt in modern history. For years, Colombian law enforcement worked alongside the DEA, tracking his every move, intercepting his communications, raiding his hideouts. They pursued him through jungles, cities, and safe houses, tearing Medellín apart in search of the man who had made himself untouchable. And then, on December 2, 1993, they got him. For the men of the search block, it was a moment of triumph. Escobar had taunted them for years, bribing officers, assassinating judges, waging a war against the very government they had sworn to protect. Now at last he was gone. But victory came with a bitter realization. Escobar was dead, but the drug trade was still alive. And law enforcement, they had no time to celebrate. Because as the Medellín Cartel crumbled, the Cali Cartel rose in its place, more disciplined, more sophisticated, and far more elusive. Unlike Escobar, the Cali bosses did not wage open war against the state. They didn't plant bombs or execute politicians in broad daylight. Instead, they used money. Bribes replaced bullets. Corruption ran so deep that even some of the officers who had fought Escobar now found themselves working for his successors. The rules of the game had changed, and law enforcement had to adapt. With the help of the DEA, the Colombian government shifted tactics. No longer chasing a single, larger-than-life figure like Escobar, they began dismantling entire networks. Surveillance became more advanced, undercover operations more precise. The days of hunting one kingpin were over. Now, they were hunting the system itself. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized the truth. The drug war was bigger than Colombia. It stretched across borders, through the streets of Miami, New York, and Mexico City. It reached into the highest levels of power, where politicians and bankers turned a blind eye to the billions being laundered through their institutions. Escobar had been a monster, but he had been a visible one. The new enemies were different. They wore suits instead of bulletproof vests. They moved their product through international banking systems instead of jungle airstrips. They spoke in coded business deals instead of threats. The search block was eventually disbanded. The officers who had once hunted Escobar scattered. Some became decorated heroes, others disappeared into the shadows, their methods too controversial to be acknowledged. And in the years that followed, a grim realization set in. Escobar had been defeated. But the war? The war had only just begun. More than 30 years after his death, Pablo Escobar remains one of the most infamous criminals in history. His story has been told and retold, through books, documentaries, TV series, and films. His face is printed on t-shirts, his life turned into a spectacle for audiences who never lived through the terror he created. For some, he is a cautionary tale, a man who reached too far, who let power and ego lead him to destruction. For others, he is a folk hero, a criminal, yes, but one who defied governments, built homes for the poor, and became larger than life. The truth lies somewhere in between. The truth lies somewhere in between. Escobar was not just a man, he was a force of nature, a product of his time, his country, and the brutal realities of the drug trade. He was both feared and worshipped, hunted and protected. He was a father, a murderer, a billionaire, and a fugitive. But most importantly, he was not the end of the story. Because even in death, the empire he built never truly collapsed. The cocaine trade is stronger than ever, now controlled by new cartels, new leaders, new players who learned from his mistakes. The methods have changed, but the war remains the same. And so, the question lingers. Did the world truly defeat Pablo Escobar? Or did it simply create smarter versions of him? The answer is still being written. And if history has taught us anything, it won't be long before another name rises from the shadows, ready to take his place. If you want to uncover more stories of crime, power, and the hidden truths behind history's most dangerous figures, make sure to subscribe. Because the past is never truly gone, especially when it's built on blood and money.